Hello, and welcome to our first lecture where we're going to be dealing with a country in the Arab world. In other words, today we begin with Egypt because not only is it the most populous country in the Arabic-speaking world, usually what historically happens in Egypt, or I should say what happens in Egypt historically, causes reverberations and influence throughout the Arab world. If we could say it's kind of a trendsetter, for the lack of a better word. So we will begin with the Ottoman Empire historically ruled Egypt for most of this class period. Okay. Now, I mean, we've come a long way. Remember, we began in ancient Egypt. For most of its history, its most recent history, it was a province of the Ottoman Empire. If you wanted the exact date, when was it? 1512, it became part of the Ottoman Empire. And then for quite a long time until 1914, when the British, you see, the British, remember the primary source there you were given on the midterm. The British always had influence in Egypt. And then by 1880s, it was more or less the British were in charge in Egypt. But they maintained the fiction of it's still part of the Ottoman Empire. And by 1914, when the Ottomans sided with Germany during World War I, Britain said, okay, that's it, enough with the charade, or enough with the facade. Egypt is now part of the British Empire. So that begins from 1914, in other words, the beginning of World War I. And then we're going to do just about 100 years of history. Really, this class, we'll end around 2014. I don't know where I put it. Well, it was probably the year 2016 when I last. I created the slide. I mean, I'm going to update it, of course, because, like I said, I want to just do 100 years of Egyptian history, but then I am going to finish just briefly with the effects of COVID-19 on each country. So I just didn't update the slide. Anyway. Before we go into these images, it's best let me have one of the great scholars on women in the Middle East, Layla Ahmed, speak about what these images are telling us. Layla Ahmed herself is Egyptian. And having said that, having introduced her, let us go to her interview with the BBC.
Layla Ahmed was born in Cairo and grew up in the city in the 40s and 50s, raised by a generation of Muslim women who never wore Islamic dress. She's now Professor of Divinity at Harvard University and observes that increasing numbers of young women in her native Egypt and in her adopted country, America, are, at the very least, now covering their heads. She's written a book about the changes that have occurred during her lifetime. It's called A Quiet Revolution, The Veil's Resurgence from Middle East to America. What does she remember of the way women dressed when she was a girl?
Ordinary Western, rather modest dress. So you didn't wear sleeveless dresses. You wore not long-sleeved, but at least down to the elbow.
Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm sharing the sound. Yes, okay. So let's keep on
going. You wore longish sorts of skirts, not mini skirts, although later, by the 60s, mini skirts were not unusual in Cairo either. So it was Western-style conservative dress.
And at what point did you notice a change in the Middle East to more conservative, what one would perceive as Islamic dress?
Well, it was Islamic dress, actually. It was around the mid-1970s. Is the first group of women were seen wearing this, and it was, oddly enough, amazingly enough to the people of the time, it was university women, college students. So it completely broke the stereotype that veiling is something for ignorant people, peasants, or, this was the stereotype. And here we had university women, of all women, people starting to, and from there it spread. And it was very tied to the rise of what we call the Islamic resurgence.
But were these young women choosing to wear the veil because they wanted to go along with the Islamic resurgence, or were they being required to wear it?
No, it was choice. It was very much choice. Their own, I mean, they wore it for whatever reasons, because they believed in the Islamic resurgence. They were participating in what was really a resistance movement. And we hear, the revolution that we've seen recently in the Middle East, there's a lot of resonance. It was when Mubarak was removed, there was a lot of anger at corruption of the elite and of how they'd been keeping money to themselves and not allowing. This was exactly what was happening in the 70s, under Sadat.
And when you observed it in America, I was so shocked. You're right of being shocked at seeing young women on an American campus wearing a hijab.
Yes.
What was driving those young Americans to wear it?
It really was the inheritance. I mean, they're completely unaware, but they are people like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic groups which were pro-veiling and spread the veil in the Middle East, actually came to the West, and they established mosques and they established Muslim organizations. So a lot of the young people who were born in America, a lot of immigrant parents, were not necessarily part of the Islamic movement, but they sent their children to mosques. They wanted to learn about Islam, and the form of Islam they got was the one which required wearing hijab.
So curiously, there was a group of young American women not wearing the hijab because their fathers were forcing them to wear it, but actually defying their parents in a way.
Absolutely. That's the great irony of lots of parents who are appalled. Say, why are you wearing this? This is not what we grew up with. And the young people were insisting on wearing it, partly because of what they've learned in the mosque. But one has to also think there is teenage rebellion here. It's a way of being critical of your parents. You say, I'm different from you. Your values are not necessarily mine. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on too.
What do you make of the response of a country like France banning a face veil in public places and being very open about their objection to this kind of covering?
Yes. Well, let's backtrack, because they banned the head veil, the headscarf, in schools before they banned the face veil. And it's worth remembering that so did Egypt, and so did Turkey, so did countries who were afraid of Islamic fundamentalism. They thought banning the veil was the answer. In fact, it backfired, and it was often exactly not the answer. So it's about a response to the hijab in any form, whether headscarf or face veil. Now, I found the whole debate that's going on in France, what was astonishing to me is that they banned it apparently because it's sexist. That's bizarre. I don't think it's any more sexist than bikinis, actually.
What do you mean you don't think it's any more sexist than a bikini?
Well, I do think, if you think about it, I'm part of the old feminist movement. I remember the days in America in the 60s and 70s when Americans refused to shave their legs, they refused to wear bra. Remember the famous bra burning, so on? So this is about protests about how women's bodies are constructed for consumption, for sexual consumption, the way they advertise cars and all of that. So it's completely... bikinis, I'm sure, in that old feminist view, would not at all be unsexist. They're very sexist. And I personally don't think I'll even wear a head hijab, let alone a face hijab. But I don't think I want to wear a bikini either.
So are you saying that these young women are not Islamic fundamentalists, but feminists objecting to the way Western women are objectified?
Yes, actually. I wouldn't say all of them, but some of the women I interviewed said things like, we wear it because we're protesting about sexist dress in our country. Anorexia, is that a good thing? That's part of the construction of women's bodies. So why is the hijab any worse than having to be very thin,
But what impact is their action, their decision to take on the veil, having on the way Western Islam is perceived? How much do you fear that it does provoke Islamophobia?
I don't think the veil itself, the veil is tapping into a heritage of thinking the veil is bad or negative. You know, that's how I saw it when I began. You don't have to be pure Western to do that. That's a construction. That's an idea that's been put in our heads, and we need to challenge that. And I think actually one of the things I noticed, that people of a younger generation who never wore hijab, were non-Muslims, see their peers, 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds wearing it, they are much more accepting than older people. To them, it's just a different style of dress. Why shouldn't you be free to dress as you wish? So I do think there's the rising generation of Westerners don't question it anything like the way older people did.
And when you look at what is happening in the Middle East, the revolutions that are going on
Yes.
at the moment, from a woman's perspective,
Yeah.
how concerned are you that they will become victims there of Islamic fundamentalism or not?
Well, it's a tough question. I mean, I think my fears are not simply about Islamic fundamentalism. All kinds of other forms of power could seize the revolution and institute new corrupt governments, you know. I do think the revolution itself shows us that there are people that we can have a lot of confidence in. The young people of Egypt and Tunisia and so on are people who want justice for their societies. So even if it may not turn out to be that wonderful in the short run, but I think what we saw is proof that there are people who really care about democracy and equality in society. So given that, that gives me confidence. But how it's going to turn out exactly in the short run, I don't know.
I was talking to Professor Leila Ahmed.
Okay, so that was an interview with an Egyptian scholar who, of course, moved to the US. But a lot of the trends she talked about the veil becoming kind of a symbol of resistance, began in Egypt, particularly against the British. And well, she doesn't say it explicitly. A good number of the people in the American universities who happen to veil, even against their parents' wishes, also happen to be Egyptian. So it's paradoxical because now if we go to kind of a series of images that accompanied an article written by Leila Ahmed. So you see here, these Egyptian women, 1895, they're, you know, wearing a full veil. And this was just, yeah, simply the way you went in public. And then from the 20s to the 40s, okay, the modern feminist ideal took in Egypt. And as a result, the veil became a symbol of, well, pre-modernity. If feminism, by definition, if it ends in ism, is modern, then yeah, the veil was kind of the symbol of the pre-modern. And there again, yeah, these are just Egyptian women on the beach in Alexandria. You'll get the idea. And, you know, there was no religious patriarchy present. That was, you know, would prevent this. And furthermore, yeah, this is also, you have to realize we're seeing also a class issue here. These would be members of the Egyptian elite who would be dressing like this. And then by 2011, we see the veil since the 1980s making a comeback in Egypt. So this is a question. Yes, where do we begin? How did all of this begin? Just a second here. Sorry, my PowerPoint's frozen. Oh. Okay, it's not. By now, anyway. So let's just go to my face for now, and then we'll go back to the slides. So to begin, like I said, I'll never ask you, this is a class on Middle Eastern women, but of course, in particular cases, I will be talking about men who spoke about women's issues. And the first that I want to discuss is Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu would be considered, so now what time period are we talking about Egypt? This is the late 1800s. But Muhammad Abdu was questioning how did Egypt come to a condition where it was fell to British control, and how should Egyptians, in the face of British dominance, what is the solution for Egyptians? He came up with an idea that we would call Islamic modernism. And his argument was Islam needs to adapt to an age of isms. So as part of kind of his Islamic modernization vision, what was he arguing for? That Muslims need to adopt mass education, even studying secular subjects, so that Egyptian society could advance, so science, technology, engineering. Along this regard, basically, he was saying only Egypt, once it was modern, could stand up to British control. Okay, so that involved mass education, but also developing modern infrastructure, so on and so forth. But this is what was surprising about Muhammad Abdu. Was in his kind of ideology of Islamic modernism, he says mass means mass. In other words, it's not just the mass of men who have to be educated, but so do women. In other words, now talk about, this is the late 1800s. This was quite even revolutionary by European standards. I mean, if we compare Egypt to Russia, the idea that women should read was unheard of, right? But anyway, and the thing about Islamic modernism was that he could find rationales in Islamic history to justify his stance. In other words, so the argument is that society, according to Abdu, cannot be modern unless the masses are educated, and that includes women. Okay? And the example he gave was, now just to go back in time, of Khadija, Muhammad's wife and the first convert to Islam. If you remember, she had operated a very successful caravan trade, which would have meant Khadija was literate as well as knew how to do finances and math. By the way, the Prophet Muhammad himself was illiterate. Okay, so when we talk about in terms of the marriage, Khadija was his boss, and we assume literate, whereas Prophet Muhammad wasn't. Now, this is what was revolutionary about kind of Abdu's Islamic modernization project was this. Regarding polygamy, okay, you see he said polygamy should be thought of as a pre-modern institution. And why is that? Well, he says, let's use historical context to guide us in the present. And what did the historical context of polygamy tell us? When Muhammad was reducing the amount of wives from unlimited polygamy to 4, that was revolutionary for its day. But why didn't he eliminate it entirely? Well, it was necessity. Remember, when the Muslim community was very small, and in a single battle, you could have maybe, a large group of widows and orphans overnight. It was necessary for men to take multiple wives in order to take care of the widows and the children so they don't be orphans. According to his kind of idea of Islamic modernization now, today's circumstances don't require this. And then the other element was, while it was Islamic modernization, he didn't believe people should wear modern Western clothes, okay? In other words, mass-produced clothes. At the same time, he was arguing Muslims should wear traditional clothes. And again, for traditional clothing then, a lot of women who followed Abdu took the tradition to mean the veil. And this is where the trend begins. So if we look at just look at this quote from Muhammad Abdu. Sorry, guys, again, just having, okay, there we go. It's just sluggish today. Men and women are equal before God in the matter of reward, when they're equal in the works. There is therefore no difference between them in regard to humanity, and no superiority over one over the other in works. Okay. In other words, what is Muhammad Abdu doing? He is fighting religious patriarchy. Okay? I mean, here is a religious scholar who is really trying to fight the established religious patriarchy this time. Okay. Now, to kind of juxtapose Muhammad Abdu, I would have to now speak of his antithesis, and his name would be Qasim Amin. Okay. A-M-I-N, and of course, you know, I'm not going to be asking about him on the exam per se, so, you know, don't worry. But you think, sorry guys, just technical problems. I think by now that would be resolved. But anyway. So Qasim Amin would represent the other trend of modernization in Egypt, but the secular modernizing trend. Okay? And while Qasim Amin, so we could say he was contemporary, I mean, more or less around the same time as Muhammad Abdu. In fact, Qasim Amin was influenced by Muhammad Abdu. But he was secular in his approach. And of course, for him to get his modern education, he went and studied in France. And then upon studying in France, he came back to the Middle East, to Egypt, and tried to implement his vision of modernity, his vision of secular modernity. And for him, that meant encouraging women to disregard the veil as a pre-modern artifact. Now, again, this was quite revolutionary for his time because his wife veiled and would refuse to take off her veil, but he was able to succeed with his younger daughter. So in 1899, he wrote a book called The Liberation of Women, where now he is calling for women to no longer don the veil as a means of transforming Egypt into a modern state. But keep in mind, remember where did Amin studied? He studied in France. And really when he's saying that the veil is pre-modern, it should be abandoned for Egypt to modernize, Qasim Amin just becomes an Egyptian voice for what was the British attitude at the time. In other words, he kind of internalizes the colonial mentality. And I mean, really, all he is at the end of the day is somebody just from the middle class. That is more or less saying that Islamic culture is pre-modern and inferior, and we should adopt, in Amin's words, superior modern European lifestyle. Okay. So while Muhammad Abdu found kind of a synthesis, Qasim Amin's ideas were really an adapt to, so Muhammad Abdu, you have to realize, was calling for Islamic modernization to resist the British. More or less, Qasim Amin kind of internalizes British attitudes. Okay. Now, where's the patriarchy here then? Well, think about it. Qasim Amin is trying on one level to say, to eliminate it's a kind of a religious patriarchy and replace it with a Western patriarchy. Because you see, in Qasim Amin's book, The Liberation of Women, he is not saying this should be a matter of choice. He is saying to women, this is how you should dress so we can advance. And that is patriarchy at the end of the day. Even though he's an Egyptian, he is advancing a Western version of patriarchy. Okay. So let's look at a primary source from Amin. Oops, sorry. Okay, that's, sorry, I forgot. This guy, not really so important. But let's read over his, what he says. You see here, this is not a Islamic modernist position. This is an Islamist position. And perhaps now I should distinguish what's the difference. Okay. An Islamic modernist tries to, well, reconcile the faith with modernism, that ism, and Islamist, or what we can say Islamism. So Talat Harb was, again, maybe a contemporary of Muhammad, not maybe, he was a contemporary of Muhammad Abduh. But the Islamist position would be what you're seeing expressed here. You would find kind of Islamist positions today. What are Islamist groups? Well, ISIS is one. Okay. And Al-Qaeda is an Islamist group. Really an Islamic fundamentalist group, but we just abbreviate that and call them an Islamist. Okay. Look at the Islamist position here then. Women were created for men's pleasure, to take care of domestic affairs. They were not created by God to defeat men. If God wanted to do so, he would have given, look at these things, courage, intrepidity, chivalry, audacity, which is not the case, okay? And if women want to behave men and carry heavy burdens to be equal, this would be them abandoning the duty given to them by God. You can't get a better example of religious patriarchy than this. This is kind of quintessential religious patriarchy. There you go. Now, compare it to Qasim Amin. Okay. Look at the following. And now you could get where, even from the secular position, and he's writing in the name of modernity, this is still patriarchal. Well, he's criticizing Egyptian women. They don't know how to comb their hair. They don't bathe more than once a week. They don't know how to use a toothbrush. They don't know how to dress. Okay. And even though that should be the most important thing, because attractiveness and cleanliness is needed to get men to pay attention to them, more or less. Okay. They don't know how to arouse their husbands, nor maintain his desire. And why is this? Because ignorant women do not understand inner feelings, attraction, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there you go. That's just societal patriarchy at the end of the day. Good old-fashioned societal patriarchy. Cultural societal patriarchy. Okay. Now, before I get to this primary source, so let me tell you what is happening in Egypt. So, I'm just looking what time is it, sorry. Oh, anyway. Okay, I'm looking at the election results. Sorry, I shouldn't be doing this. But... Okay. Pay attention. So, you know, imagine World War I happens. Britain is still in charge of Egypt. It's more or less a British colony. Okay. And then what occurs is Britain goes through the kind of the motion, the charade that Egypt is independent. Egypt would be ruled by a king. And now why a king? Well, because Britain has kings. So in other words, Egypt was kind of mimicking the British style of government. Right? But for the most part, we can say Egypt was a king with a pliant Egyptian king, but Egypt was more or less a colony. So in 1919, you have a movement to basically weaken, if not entirely expel, the British, and have the king establish a parliament with the actual competitive elections, with parliament actually having some say. 1919, the protests saw a good number of women take part. Now, this is the thing. Women usually take part historically in revolutions. They rarely reap the awards, okay? So the 1990 revolts were very much kind of an anti-British demonstration. Britain relented, but still maintained military forces within the country. So this is then the question we have to ask. The women who took part in the demonstrations, what was the women's movement like in Egypt? What kind of movement? What can we say are the origins of the modern feminist movement, and what was the modern feminist movement in Egypt calling for? Okay. So let's go back to 10 years earlier, before the Egyptian revolt. Okay. And let's look at the following primary source. Now, Bahithat al-Badia is, you're not going to be able to tell from the name, but she's a woman. Okay. And we could consider her one of the first modern Egyptian feminists. And she's giving a lecture in the Ummah Party. Okay, the Ummah Party would be an Islamic modernist party. So in other words, a good 10 years before what we're seeing in this primary source is a good 10 years before the various parties take to the streets to revolt against British influence. More or less, they were having meetings, they were agitating, trying to, basically create a strong Egypt that could stand up to colonial control. So what does she begin? Well, she goes back into history. Talks about women who fought with, I don't expect you to know who Omar is. We talked about him, but that was a long time ago. He was the second caliph, okay? So in other words, when she's talking about Hawla bint al-Azwar al-Kindi, she's talking about this kind of female warrior who went to Syria to free her brother that was held by the Greeks. But then this is interesting. What does she do? She situates the life of Hawla into this kind of global sisterhood of courageous women from a historical perspective. Okay, she refers to Joan of Arc, and of course you have to realize now the audience at the Ummah Party would have understand who Joan of Arc was. And then of course she also refers to women who became queens, but were also adept in politics. So she talks about Catherine the Great of Russia, Queen Isabel, Queen Elizabeth, and then she goes into Egypt. All right. But so it's quite amazing because not only was al-Badia familiar, in other words, she is giving kind of a gendered version of history. She's familiar with Western monarchs. But then she goes to Cleopatra, the woman we talked about, so ancient Egypt, right? But then, this is quite interesting, she has to jump quite later, but it's still, Shajarat ad-Dur was the mother of Turan Shah, of a dynasty known as the Mamluks, the last dynasty of Egypt that was later defeated by the Ottomans. Wow, sorry. I didn't talk about her. I just realized in the historical section. I have to make a note of this. I mean, I wrote a whole chapter on her in my history book of the Middle East. Not a whole chapter, a whole section on her. And they just completely, that's what happens when you talk kind of spontaneously, or, I'm trying to make this a conversation, but sometimes you do need to plan properly. I just make a note of this if you don't mind. And it's too late now, but yeah, she was just a very capable leader who was leading Egypt during the Crusades when it was at a time of war. And then, okay. I guess I could have just paused the video. Now, I want you to look at this primary source. If I had the right to legislate, I would decree, okay? Because this is now what we're seeing, the fusion of feminism and Islamic modernism. And why is this so important? Because it goes against the narrative that there's something about Islam that is inherently anti-modern or pre-modern. Okay? So, in other words, read through her list, because when we see what's in her list, in more other words, she's saying this is something that's missing or lacking. Okay? So number one, teaching the girls the Quran and the Sunnah, or in other words, the tradition of the life of Muhammad. Remember the word, the hadith I told you about, sayings attributed to Muhammad. In other words, the masses of women were not given access to religious education. This is what she's calling for. In other words, calling for women to have access to religious education in a public school, that's modern. She's calling for modern educational institutions, okay, to teach religion. But then not all, because the number two deals with the secular, that primary and secondary school. In other words, all through K through 12 education. And that it should be compulsory. Well, again, that's modern. The idea that schooling should be compulsory for the mass of people under the age of, who are defined as children today, but, basically kids. The idea that kids should have the right and that the state should enforce the right of children, those masses, let's just say for the sake of convenience, under the age of 18, should go to school is also a very modern idea. Finally, then, what should they be taught? Home economics, health, first aid, and childcare. Okay. Again, now, this is, in other words, because this is lacking, right? And not every household gives kind of a standard education in terms of something very much needed, health and first aid. In other words, for girls to be taught modern science. Now, look at this. And again, what is she saying? That this is something that was missing. A quota for females in medicine. That means they have to go to modern medical schools. And why is that prevented now? Because I should be looking up at you, sorry. All right, my head is down. It's because the British authorities, remember this kind of a jerk, his name, just a couple lectures ago, the British colonial jerk who not only prevented this from happening, but he was against women having the right to vote in Britain. I can't believe I forgot. Anyway, it's been a long week. In other words, in demand number 4, this is really her way of resisting British colonialism. And remember, what is modern about British colonialism? The mass distance that is involved. Britain's domination in Egypt was for 2 modern reasons. To control the Suez Canal, that modern waterway that was built that cut British shipping by so much time that British ships could get to India much more efficiently, as well as British interest in Egyptian cotton to this day. Very prized cotton comes from Egypt, irrigated by the Nile. And of course, that Egyptian cotton would be used in the textile mills of Manchester, where mass-produced clothes was then produced, sold in London, also back to the Egyptians. Okay, so in other words, you have to realize 1909, this speech to the Ummah party is not only to the men, keep in mind, it's to the men in the Ummah party, because while they were, Muhammad Abdu, the progenitor of Islamic modernism, was forward thinking. Not every man in that party was. Basically, she's saying, if the British leave, or if the British kind of allow for a genuine parliamentary system, and the British, despite being the home of parliament, did not like parliaments in their colonies. There's a reason for that, because if you let the people elect members of parliament in Egypt, what are they going to call for? For the British to leave. So this was also the kind of irony of British colonialism. So in this primary source here, what is al-Badia calling for? It is that you men in the audience, this is what I'm calling for. And if there was a time where we get elected to parliament and I could legislate. This is what I would call for. In other words, this is a feminist manifesto. Okay, so modern education, modern medicine to provide modern scientific healthcare to the masses of women. Now, keep in mind, what was the nature of women's healthcare in Egypt? Usually it would be done by elder women. Remember the women in the Ottoman Empire who would treat smallpox, okay? And, you know, a lot of the elderly women, a lot of their folk remedies work, but she also wants the advantage of modern medicine at the same time. So what do we see here? Through 1 through 5, it primarily deals with education. Education was being denied to women in Egypt. Okay. Then what do we see here? Number 6, not much for me to comment on. Let's look at number 7. The end of fixed marriages, okay, arranged marriages, okay, that at least, you know, women and men to marry should be done, at least let them see and talk to each other without the families just kind of negotiating their future lives. Okay. That is governed by religious law, but you see how there's a role for interpretation? Adopting the veil and outdoor dress of Turkish women of Istanbul. So what's happening by 1909? There's just kind of a looser veil, like you gave women more freedom, not the complete face veil. Now, number 9 is completely, has nothing to do really with the modern feminist woman movement. Okay. It is about kind of boycotting British goods. And finally, who is she calling for? Who is her audience? The men of Egypt to implement this program. In terms of the kind of global feminist movement, this was quite a radical, brave document. And it was quite impressive for the Ummah party to allow her to speak around this time. This is what she meant by the new kind of veil. Remember the other one was kind of like more flowing, more or less, this kind of gave more freedom to move. So these were kind of some of the first feminist agitators against the British in Egypt. And yeah, these are scenes from the 1919 revolt against British control. And so do you have to remember here, now this is a veil, but it's not so much as religious patriarchy as, well, again, unveiled woman in Egypt was unheard of around this time. So it's religious, cultural, but then also remember Layla Ahmed's interview. The veil wasn't just the veil, it was, it was called for women to unveil, right? Around this time, this is still 1919. But the point is, the veil here is also seen as a symbol of authenticity, of resisting British colonial culture. Then, what do we see in this radical act that happened in 1923? Well, let's save that for next lecture. Let me pause here because it's been 50 minutes.